Hey guys, JoeNerbs here coming at you with a Spire side chat. It's been a little while. I had to learn Defect before I felt comfortable talking about Defect cards, and then I was busy doing other stuff, and now here I am, ready to talk about some Defect cards. So today I wanted to talk about Self-Repair. Self-Repair seems like maybe sort of a boring card to start with, but it happens to be one of the cards that I seem to think the most differently about from everybody else than any other card in the Defect card pool. Self-Repair is a very, very, very highly picked uncommon for Defect. Lots of people express surprise that I'm passing it, or say that they would have taken that situation or whatever. I just don't think this card is very good. I don't think it performs super well on any difficulty level, really, and I wanted to explain super clearly why this card isn't that great, and also give you clear reasons why I might take it in some situations, because there are situations where I think that it is very good, but they're quite limited and specific. I wanted to give you a couple of examples. So, Self-Repair 1 energy at the end of combat, heals 7 HP. I think the simplest, most blunt, straightforward way I can explain the drawback of this card and why this card just isn't that great is that it is a curse in the fight that you're in right now. If you're in the Act 3 boss fight and you're trying to beat Time Eater or whatever, this card doesn't do anything. It doesn't heal you 7 until the end of the combat, but I mean, maybe written on the card it should say, if you won. Because if you lose the combat, which is the other way that the combat can end, it doesn't actually heal you 7 HP, you just lose the run. That's really unfortunate. So in Act 3 boss fights, this literally does nothing. In Act 2 boss fights, it basically does nothing. If you're against the 2 orb walkers in Act 3 and they're just pounding on you for 30, 40 damage a turn, and you're trying to get them dead, and you gotta deal 90 damage before you die and stuff, and you draw Self-Repair, what the fuck is this card doing in my deck is generally going to be my feeling. This card does not help us get out of the fight that we're in right now. It sets us up well for the next fight, but only if we won. And starting with the assumption that you win every fight that you go into in Slay the Spire is going to lead to some very odd opinions about how the game works. You definitely don't win every fight that you go into in Slay the Spire, and every fight that you lose in Slay the Spire, Self-Repair was a dead card in. So that's the problem with Self-Repair. I think that Self-Repair, on average, causes you to lose more health against all the boss fights, against the Act 2 elites, all of the Act 2 elites, and against all of the Act 3 elites. And against Transient. And the fights that I've just listed are some of the toughest fights in the game. These are the fights that are likely to kill you. These are the fights that you would like your deck to be good against, and Self-Repair is actively making your deck worse in those fights. So I'm not very eager to put Self-Repair into my deck in general. However, what Self-Repair does, the effect that it has, is quite valuable. It heals you 7 HP at the end of combat, or if upgraded, it heals you 10 HP at the end of combat. And getting Sustain into your deck is really nice. Defect doesn't have a ton of Sustain outside of Self-Repair, or some very powerful relics that you may be lucky to get. I'm gonna sneeze. Alright. Bonus sneeze this episode. I hope you guys enjoyed that. So there are some very good sustain relics like Bird-Faced Urn or Bloody Idol as an event relic that you can get, or things like that. And then there's some mediocre sustain relics like Blood Vial, for example, is a mediocre sustain relic. Singing Bowl does a little bit of sustain. Singing Bowl is really good because it gives you max HP as well, but the sustain element of it is pretty mediocre. It can be pretty hard to find sustain for Defect. And sustain's pretty important for Defect because Defect is not a class which will tend to win fights without taking damage. I think for Silent, you don't have any sustain at the start, but sustain's a little bit less relevant than it is for defect because silent just is so good at blocking, and a lot of silent strategies revolve around blocking a ton while deploying immensely efficient sources of damage like 1,000 cuts or noxious fumes or whatever, and silent can get through fights without taking much damage at all. Defect, in my experience, is much more hit and miss than that. You do have some really nice block cards, like Glacier, for example, is the clear best probably, but Boot Sequence is also very, very good. Boot Sequence is a 0-cost 10 block card that will start in your opening hand, and because you have access to Hologram, if you don't play it in your opening turn, you're probably going to be able to get it back with Hologram on a turn where you do want it at some point in the fight. So Defect does have some decent block available, but often your deck won't block well enough in the starting turns, and you'll take some damage in hallway fights, and you won't have access to sustain very easily unless you've got a relic that does it. And so you're left wondering how on earth you're going to sustain. The only option really that's left is potions or resting at rest sites, and resting at rest sites sucks because you don't get upgrades, and potions suck because you just don't get them very consistently. There are too many potions for you to reliably get a regen potion over and over again. Self-repair is one solution to this problem, right? It is an expensive solution to the problem to pick for the reasons that I outlined before, the fact that it's a curse in your deck in the fight that you're in, and so on and so forth. Generally speaking, I find that if my run is relying on self-repair in the second half of the run for my sustain, probably something has gone immensely wrong. Generally, I would rather just rely on campfires for sustain than self-repair in the second half of a run, because I would rather just not have like 2 or 3 upgrades and go into the boss fight and have one less curse in my deck for Defect. Defect has immense scaling, and a lot of Defect's cards do not need to be upgraded to do what they want to do. Glacier is a great example, again. Just blocks for a bunch and channels 2 Frost. You're going to want to upgrade your Defragment, and honestly, if you have an upgraded Defragment and a Glacier that's unupgraded in your deck, you win most of the boss fights. Like, Defect scaling is just completely off the wall incredible. So I don't want to have curses in my deck so that I can get to the few scaling cards in my Defect card pool, which are very, very good in boss fights. But I'm not too worried about like needing a ton of upgrades in order to actually win the boss fights, and so I'm pretty happy to just be resting at campfires and not have a self-repair in my deck in the double orb walker fight or in the transient fight or something like that. Now, there are 2 very specific situations where I think self-repair is a really good pickup, and I wanted to talk about what those were. And I'm not saying that these are the only situations where I think self-repair is a good pickup, but I wanted to give you examples of me justifying why I'm taking self-repair in some situations where I would take self-repair, so you understand what some examples of really good things about it are. And number 1 is at the beginning of Act 1, if I'm looking at a path with a lot of elites, self-repair is quite valuable. Let's go into that in quite a lot of depth, because this is a Spire side chat. So, Act 1, you're typically looking at 0 to 1 rests if you path through Act 1 aggressively on Ascension 15 and like build your deck well and use potions well and stuff like that. 0 to 1 rests is pretty normal in Act 1. Sometimes you'll be looking at an elite path, and the elite path is like, like maybe you can get through without any rests, maybe you need 2 rests, like you're just sort of in a situation where it's pretty clear that getting some help for that elite path could help you get fewer rests in Act 1, which could help you set up to kill the Act 1 boss and Act 2 elites and hallway fights and stuff like that. And self-repair works really nicely in that situation as a way to get out of elite fights with better health, specifically because of how it interacts with the Act 1 elites. It's less about the card self-repair than it is about who the elites are and how they interact with self-repair. Against Lagavulin, you have 3 turns at the start of the fight where you can play the powers in your deck without having to worry about Lagavulin attacking you back or anything. And regularly in the Lagavulin fight, if you have self-repair in your deck, you'll just get to play it on an early turn with it costing you very, very little to get into play. And so self-repair is excellent against Lagavulin. Against Gremlin Knob, one of the problems for Defect is that Defect is a skill-heavy deck at the start of a run. You definitely want to prioritize getting attacks like Ball Lightning into your deck for Gremlin Knob. But you're still a deck that's tied to skills for mitigation, quite likely. You don't have access to weak, perhaps, and your block cards don't block for too much, and so it's hard to justify playing your block cards when they're giving Gremlin Knob 2 strength every time you play a block card. Self-repair gives you... it effectively cancels 7 damage as long as you don't die in the fight, so it's sort of like a block card in that situation, but it doesn't give Gremlin Knob 2 strength. And so self-repair is quite good against Gremlin Knob. And against the Tri-Sentries, self-repair is a card that I will often play on the second cycle through the deck when the fight is down to just one or two of the sentries remaining. And in those situations, self-repair is usually a pretty good card. So I think self-repair actually, on average, helps you in all of the Act 1 Elite fights. I don't think it, on average, helps you in any of the Act 2 Elite fights. So that's sort of a considerable difference. So I'll take self-repair if I'm looking at an Act 1 path where I can get a lot of elites and think that I could use a little bit of help from a card that I'm not expecting to be great later on in the game, but, you know, I think that I'll get enough out of it now to be worth picking up. Another reason that I would definitely consider taking self-repair is if my deck is a deck which is very bad at early turns and hallway fights, but has immense scaling. So if I have a deck which has already picked up like some defragments and frost orbs or something like that, and it takes me a few turns to get them going, and I'm going into the beginning of Act 2-ish in this situation. Self-repair can be fine in this situation, especially if I have a bunch of card draw, so the first time through the deck I don't, feel that bad about having drawn it instead of a card that I want to play right now. Second time through the deck or third time through the deck, once the fight is stabilized, we get the self-repair into play, and we end up gaining some health at the end of the fight. And I think in those situations, self-repair helps you leave the fights with higher average HP. And I also want to stress immensely, a lot of the time that you have a deck like that, which is setting up slowly and then it's scaled to a point where it's just overwhelmingly powerful, way stronger than the hallway fight can hope to deal damage to. A lot of the time you've got an Echo Form in that deck. And Echo Form works very nicely with self-repair. First card you play each turn is played twice. So how this works is the first time through your deck you play Echo Form. After that, like from that point probably, your deck is strong enough that you're not at much risk of taking further damage. You stall the fight out for a while, and the second time through your deck you play your self-repair. And your self-repair doubles in this situation, which is very valuable. So yeah, having an upgraded self-repair has been instrumental for me, having some runs where I've taken 4 elite fights with 1 campfire in Act 1. It's also been instrumental for some Act 2s where I'm on 3 energy and I'm using Echo Form. And decks like that will often be fine against bosses if you get to them on full health. Like if you walk into the champ fight or the collector fight on 70 health with a deck with Echo Form and 3 energy, probably if you've got enough other stuff in your deck you're going to be okay. But the decks aren't that good at killing hallway fights without taking a lot of damage. And you expect it against the champ and collector to take 30 or 40 damage too, and maybe 10 to 20 damage against hallway fights. Getting a self-repair plus into that deck, which I can duplicate with Echo Form hopefully in all of the hallway fights, has, I would say, won some runs that I would otherwise have lost for sure. So those are the situations where I really like self-repair. I talked hopefully enough about why I don't think it's just a generically good card. There are lots of situations where I don't like self-repair at all. And I hope you enjoyed my return to SpireChats. Sorry if I ranted. Sorry if I am frothing at the mouth or whatever. I'd love to hear your thoughts and comments, so on and so forth. And I hope to see ya next time. We'll talk about some more defect stuff, probably. Alright. Bye-bye.